In 1945, on a lush green island fringed by coral seas, an entire people waited for the sky to fall. Okinawa, the gateway to Japan. To the world, it was just another battlefield. To those who lived there, it was home. For centuries, the Okinawans had lived between empires, a proud island culture distinct from mainland Japan, farmers, fishermen, schoolchildren, and elders. When war came, few of them understood why. By the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had turned against Japan. Saipan had fallen. Iwo Jima was ash and bone. The Imperial High Command knew the next invasion would come to the Ryukyu Islands, and Okinawa stood directly in the path. The Japanese 32nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, arrived to turn the island into a fortress. Around 100,000 soldiers dug into caves and tunnels across the southern hills, but among them were also civilians. 300,000 Okinawans, men, women, and children, drafted into labor, conscripted as medics, or simply trapped. They were told the Americans were monsters, that capture meant torture or death. And so, when the U.S. Navy's guns opened fire on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, entire families hid in caves and prayed. The American invasion was the largest of the Pacific War, 1,300 ships, 180,000 troops, and nearly 500,000 tons of firepower. To the soldiers of the U.S. 10th Army, led by Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., Okinawa was the final step before the invasion of Japan itself. To the civilians who looked up from the fields and villages, it was the end of the world. The naval bombardment lasted 7 days. Shells turned the beaches to smoke and sand. The sea seemed to catch fire. Villages disappeared in clouds of dust. On the ground, American Marines and Army infantry advanced almost unopposed at first. The Japanese defenders had withdrawn inland, waiting behind fortified ridges. But in the chaos, civilians fled in every direction, unsure which way led to safety. A mother named Kyoko Uehara, then 16, later recalled, "The ground shook for days. We thought the ocean itself had exploded. I saw people running with no faces, burned black from the bombs. My father said we must go south to the caves. We took nothing, only a photograph of my brother who had gone to war." By mid-April, the fighting reached the hills of Shuri, where Ushijima's army had built a vast defensive line. The caves beneath those ridges became both fortress and refuge, shelter for soldiers and civilians alike. Thousands crowded together underground, surviving on rainwater and bits of rice. Children cried softly in the dark while artillery thundered above. The wounded lay beside the dying, their moans echoing through the tunnels. Japanese officers told the people to help the army. Old men carried ammunition. Teenage girls, members of the Himiyuri Student Corps, schoolgirls barely 16 years old, were ordered to serve as battlefield nurses. They worked in the tunnels under Haiburu and Shuri, tending to soldiers torn apart by shrapnel, often without light or medicine. A student nurse, Sachiko Matsumoto, later described her first night. "We were told to remove the bandages from the dead to use on the living. The smell was unbearable. There was blood everywhere. We were children, and we were told this was our duty to the Emperor." Above ground, the Americans advanced yard by yard through mud, rain, and fire. The 1st Marine Division, the 6th Marine Division, and the 96th Army Division pushed south against entrenched Japanese troops. Every hill, every village, every cave was defended to the last man. The civilians were caught in between, too terrified to surrender, too fragile to survive. When U.S. soldiers entered the caves, they often found terrified families hiding behind soldiers' corpses. Many Okinawans chose suicide over capture, sometimes encouraged by Japanese propaganda, sometimes ordered by the soldiers themselves. Whole families jumped from cliffs or detonated grenades they had been given for honor. It was tragedy multiplied by fear. American soldiers, hardened by months of island fighting, were shaken by what they saw. Some tried to help the civilians, offering food and water. Others, still under fire, couldn't tell civilians from combatants in the smoke. Okinawa became chaos, compassion and horror in the same breath. By the end of April, the once green island was a wasteland. Palm trees were splintered to stumps. Bodies lay unburied in flooded rice paddies. The cries of children mixed with the thunder of naval guns. The battle that had begun as a military operation was becoming something far worse, a collapse of humanity itself. By May 1945, Okinawa had become a landscape of ruin. Rain turned the shattered fields into rivers of mud. The wounded lay in open craters filled with brown water. And still, the guns did not stop. The Japanese 32nd Army, once numbering nearly 100,000 men, was now trapped within the Shuri line, a web of caves, tunnels, and fortified ridges stretching across southern Okinawa. General Ushijima and his chief of staff, General Cho, refused to surrender. Their orders were clear: defend Okinawa to the death. Every cave was a bunker, every ridge a final stand. The U.S. 10th Army advanced methodically, Marines and soldiers moving yard by yard through artillery fire, grenades, and machine guns hidden in the hills. The 1st Marine Division fought at Sugarloaf Hill, losing thousands to capture a position no larger than a city block. The 77th Infantry Division battled through the Shuri Castle grounds, an ancient royal site reduced to rubble by naval bombardment. The American command saw Okinawa as a necessary step before invading mainland Japan, but for those living and dying on the island, there was no strategy, only survival. Beneath the ridges, tens of thousands of civilians were still trapped in caves. There was no light, no air, no food. Children pressed against the cave walls as mortars exploded outside. Mothers whispered prayers while soldiers prepared grenades beside them. The civilians had been told the Americans would torture and kill them. A lie spread to keep them from surrendering. When the fighting drew closer, many believed death by their own hands was preferable. American soldiers later reported finding caves filled with entire families, bodies clutched together, a single grenade having taken them all. Others emerged from the darkness, weak and trembling, hands raised in fear. Interpreters shouted through megaphones, promising safety, but the sound of artillery drowned out every word. As May dragged on, the Japanese defenses crumbled under the relentless bombardment. Caves collapsed. Units disappeared overnight. The Imperial Army began to retreat south toward Mabuni, the island's final line of defense. And with them came the civilians. Thousands of Okinawans fled south through fields of corpses and burning villages. Those who survived the shelling faced hunger and disease. Many drank from puddles tainted with blood and ash. In the chaos, families were torn apart. Kamikichi Shinjo, a schoolteacher, later recalled the march. We moved at night. The sky glowed red behind us. The smell of burning flesh was everywhere. People carried the old on their backs until they could no longer walk. The weak were left by the roadside. We did not look back. For American troops, the toll was also immense. By early June, over 50,000 U.S. casualties, dead, wounded, or missing, had been recorded. The battle had become the bloodiest of the Pacific. On June 1st, the Shuri line fell. The Japanese Army's command post was gone, and with it, the last hope of organized resistance. But the fighting didn't stop. Ushijima ordered his surviving troops to fall back toward Mabuni Ridge, to continue resistance until the last soldier. Civilians still hiding in caves were now caught in a shrinking pocket of death. Artillery and naval shells pounded the southern hills without pause. Some Americans began calling the area the Tombstone of the Pacific. The Himayuri Student Corps, those teenage nurses who had once tended the wounded under Shuri, were now trapped near the front lines. Most had no weapons. When American troops approached, they tried to flee, but shellfire and suicide orders followed them. On June 18th, an explosion tore through one of the caves near Ihara. When it was over, more than 200 of the 240 Himayuri students were dead, many by their own grenades. Their names remain among Okinawa's most sacred memories. By mid-June, the island was nearly silent. Japanese resistance collapsed as the remaining defenders committed suicide or were killed in final charges. On June 21st, 1945, General Mitsuru Ushijima and his staff performed seppuku near Mabuni, ending the organized defense of Okinawa. The cost was unimaginable. More than 12,000 Americans were dead. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. But the civilians, the island's own people, bore the greatest loss of all. Historians estimate that between 120,000 and 150,000 Okinawans, nearly one-third of the island's population, perished in the battle. They died in shellfire, starvation, or at their own hands, victims of propaganda, fear, and an empire that had already lost its war. The battle had turned an island of farmers and fishermen into a graveyard stretching from sea to sea. As the guns fell silent, the surviving civilians stumbled from the caves, blinded by sunlight. They found their homes gone, their families vanished, their island changed forever. A U.S. Marine later wrote in his diary, "We came here to capture an island, but what we found was hell itself." The guns finally fell silent on June 22, 1945. After nearly 3 months of unbroken violence, the Battle of Okinawa was over. What remained was not victory, but devastation. Across the island, the once green hills were stripped bare. Coral reefs were blackened by oil and ash. Entire villages had vanished, replaced by craters and wreckage. The sea, once turquoise and calm, was choked with debris and bodies. The Americans called it Operation Iceberg. To the Okinawans who survived it, it was something else entirely. Tijinu Fres, the time of iron wind. In the aftermath, tens of thousands of civilians wandered the shattered landscape. Some searched for family members, others searched for food. Children wandered alone, mute and starving, their parents lost to the bombardment. The living built makeshift shelters from broken timber and burned tin. American forces quickly began organizing relief and internment camps, not as punishment but as control, to separate civilians from remaining Japanese soldiers. Many survivors were taken to these camps, where they were fed and treated for injuries and disease. But the trauma ran deeper than wounds could show. A U.S. Army doctor wrote, "We treated thousands who had no visible injuries, yet none would speak. They stared at the ground for hours. We didn't understand then that they had lost everything among the ruins of Mabuni, the last Japanese stronghold. U.S. soldiers found caves stacked with the dead, men, women, and children, their possessions laid out neatly beside them. The soldiers buried them with what dignity they could, marking the graves with wooden planks, many reading simply unknown civilian. The battle had ended, but Okinawa's suffering was not over. The island was now under American occupation, transformed into a vast military base for the coming invasion of mainland Japan, an invasion that would never come. Just weeks later, the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan surrendered. For the people of Okinawa, there was no celebration, only silence. In the years that followed, the survivors rebuilt from nothing. Rice paddies replaced battlefields. Schools rose beside mass graves. Children played among rusted tanks and unexploded shells. The scars of war were everywhere, visible and invisible. One survivor, Shigeo Nakaima, later reflected, "We learned to smile again, but inside, we were still in the caves." The war never really left us. American occupation continued long after Japan's surrender. By the 1950s, nearly 1/3 of Okinawa's land had been turned into U.S. military bases. Fences divided villages, airfields cut through farmland. Many Okinawans saw it as another kind of occupation, one that replaced the empire of Japan with the power of America. Yet even amid this, the people endured. They rebuilt their culture, their homes, and their identity, neither fully Japanese nor American, but uniquely Okinawan. As decades passed, memorials rose across the island. The Peace Memorial Park at Mabuni stands where General Ushijima made his final stand, not as a shrine to war, but to peace. Names of the dead are carved into black granite walls. Americans, Japanese, Koreans, Okinawans, all listed together without distinction. Visitors still walk those grounds today, overlooking the calm blue sea. It is hard to imagine that same coast once ran red. Historians continue to debate the battle, its necessity, its cost, its meaning. For the military, Okinawa was the final step toward ending the Pacific War. For the civilians, it was the loss of everything they had ever known. In the cold language of strategy, the battle achieved its goal. But in human terms, it revealed the true horror of modern war, that the line between soldier and civilian had vanished. More civilians died on Okinawa than in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. They were not combatants. They were farmers, students, mothers, children, ordinary people caught in a struggle between two empires. And yet, from that devastation came a lesson the world still struggles to remember, that peace is not the absence of war, but the memory of it. In Okinawa today, the wind moves gently through the tall grass over the hills of Mabuni. Beneath it, the soil still holds fragments of metal, bone, and glass, the remnants of that iron wind from 1945. Every June, survivors and their families gather to light lanterns along the shore. As dusk falls, the lanterns drift out to sea, glowing points of memory carried away by the tide. Each light represents a name, a voice, a life lost in the storm. The narrator's voice fades over the sound of waves. Here, On this island, the war ended. But the echoes of its civilians, their courage, their suffering, their silence, still whisper through the wind. The final shot lingers on the ocean, calm and endless.